I'm happy to host today in our seminar two important scholars that did a lot of writing and thinking on hybridity perspective on public policy. And this is the title really of their talk today. Thank you very much, Jarmo and Jan-Erik, for joining us. Let me introduce you both. We'll start first with Jarmo. He's a professor of local public economics and the director of the research group on public financial management at Tampere University. He's also visiting professor at the Norwegian School of Economics. He's the co-author of many publications, author and co-author of many publications, including Governing Hybrid Organization, published by Routledge. He's also the editor of Hybrid Governance, Organization and Society Value Creation and Perspective, also published via Routledge. I will not mention all his publications and credit. You will find it in the bottom of the YouTube videos that we will have today. The second presenter today is a collaborator of Jarmo, is Jan-Erik Johanson, also Professor Director of Research Group on Administrative Science at Tampere University. His latest publication, Mission-Oriented Innovation Policy as Hybridization Process, was published in Science and Public Policy. He's also the editor, co-editors and co-author of the two books that I mentioned before with Jarmo. Thank you very much both for coming to our webinar. And I will invite you now to start the presentation. Again, hybrid perspective on public policy and governance. So please, Jarmo.
Thanks so much, David, for your nice introductory words. Of course, probably even more importantly, thanks for the invitation to come to your seminar and share our ideas on our recent work on hybridity and hybrid organizations. Now let me just share the screen. So, another important question, can you see it?
Yes, we can. Just increase the size of the screen and we are fine.
Yeah. Yeah, so many thanks. But let's start. As David mentioned, we are professors from Tampere University Faculty of Management and Business. My name is Jarmo Vakkuri, and my co-author, good colleague, is Professor Jan-Erik Johanson from the same faculty. Today, our talk will address hybridity, which we, in very general terms, we will come back to the details later from different perspectives. But in very general terms, we are talking about hybridity as an interchange, as an interaction between government, business, and civil society through different dimensions, different modes of ownership, through different institutional logics, competing, contradictory, sometimes even conflictual institutional logics, diversified funding bases or resource bases, and then multiple forms of institutional social control. I will come back to the dimensions of hybridity that we talk about later. But this is the general aspect of the general topic of the talk today. And we are two presenters here, so we have divided the work so that I will start by introducing some of the basic conceptualizations on hybridity and hybrid governance based on our own work, of course, but also based on other colleagues' work in the same field. So the research on hybridity and hybrid organizations and governance, it's a sort of very expanding emergent field of research for the last years. So it has been our pleasure to see the nice development in the area of research on hybridity. But I will introduce some of the basic conceptualization, some of the basic modes of our thinking when we look at the hybrid governance and hybrid organizations. And then we would like to take you to the different context of hybridity by demonstrating some of the work that we have done regarding different fields. We will talk about briefly about hybridity in organizations, hybridity in different types of contexts, such as state-owned enterprises, social enterprises, NPOs, non-profit organizations, and so on. Very briefly, we will address hybridity among professions, which is actually a very nice field of interesting, fascinating field of public administration and management for the last recent years, talking about individuals and individual professions turning into something different than they used to be. So because of these combinations and mixes of different occupational spaces. Hybridity policymaking, we will touch, of course, that as well, as it mentioned in the title of the presentation. Just briefly mention the ongoing work that we are actually doing as we speak. We are compiling an edited book for Edvard Elgar on public policies for hybrid governance, where we try to address the issues of hybridity at the level of policymaking. Okay, but that would be the general overview of the talk. Well, I think it's good to we start to have a sort of reflection on the notion of hybridity by referring to the use of the word hybrid, and using Strauss and other colleagues, you can see that hybridity can refer to quite many different things. We know biological hybrids. We have used in our books. We have used this example of Labradoodle, which is a biological hybrid of Labrador Retriever and Poodle. So it's a sort of biological combination of some original species. Before that, most of us have heard about the hybrid cars. You cannot help hearing about hybrid cars at the moment because of the climate change and the green transformation in global terms, where you have where you try to mix different energy sources in the making of automobiles and other vehicles. And then, of course, probably you have done yourself work on hybrid warfare, which is a sort of a combination of traditional modes of warfare combined with more modern technological devices such as cyber-related activities and so on and so forth. So you have lots of different notions of hybridity in different fields. What we have been interested in a particular form of hybridity, which is institutional hybridity. So we are interested in understanding how the institutional world is shaped and reshaped by the linkages between government, business, and civil society activities and agencies and organizations. However, I think in the context of institutional hybridity, you have some of these common elements. One of the common elements with respect to other types of hybridity in biology and other fields is that hybridity is about mixing between pure types in one way or the other. So you see new types of institutional arrangements and organizations emerging from some in quotes pure species, from some earlier species. Whether the previous ones were actually pure modes of governance or pure modes of organization, it's of course another story. If you're interested in that, you should check our book from 2017, Governing Hybrid Organizations, when we actually have also a very critical reflection and discussion well, if we are dealing with hybrid organizations, probably, and then we would have to assume that there would be some pure modes of governance and organizations before that. Probably the previous forms are not pure either, but that would be another story in this respect. But I think the common denominator is that you are interested in mixing between types to create something new, and quite many things that we have been doing research on sort of are associated with this type of thinking. This is one visualization on what type of areas of hybridity we have been addressing. I think the first and probably the most important one is to first talk briefly about the dimensions of hybridity. When we have been interested in the institutional life and the hybridity of institutional life and organizations, we have addressed 4 different dimensions of hybridity. You can see hybridity through ownership. If you think about the SOE, state-owned enterprises, and their business influence and their political influence in different parts of the world, and you think that quite many of the SOEs, state-owned enterprises, are partly owned by government, partly owned by private business investors and private capital. So you can see that the mixing in terms of ownership. Another interesting context and level of analysis is what we call MOCs, municipally owned corporations, which have huge influence in different parts of the world. So you can see hybridity through ownership. And then the second dimension is to do with different institutional logics, often competing, sometimes conflicting institutional logics in place within the same system or organization. One example that I have used personally is, for instance, if you think of Finnish city or local government contracting out some of its social and healthcare services to external service providers. And those external service providers are private business firms. So within these private business firms as organizations, they have sort of a dual mission of value, basically, to enhance, of course, the shareholder value, but at the same time, actually produce and provide very basic public social healthcare service delivery. And what makes it complicated and actually interesting for research is to try to think that well, those conflicting institutional logics or contradictory institutional logics to some extent, they take place in the same context of the system or organization. Variety in the sources of financing. This opens up the world of PPPs, basically, public-private partnership arrangements, which is another sort of facet of hybridity, where public and private sector tries to collaborate in order to, for instance, to organize large infrastructure projects or large mega projects or smaller projects in the area of infrastructure, energy, even social health, and even education to some extent, and so on and so forth. So that would be the financing dimension of the, or research-based dimension of the hybridity. And the fourth one has to do with differentiated forms of social institutional control, including different forms of regulatory aspects. David has been doing excellent work on that, addressing different types of regulatory regimes and systems actually coming together in terms of the large societal systems. So you can see different types of control. You can see different types of regulatory systems. And if you see this picture, of course, here this one will hint to our interest in trying to understand different levels of hybridity. So you can discuss hybridity among individual professions, going into organizations, institutional fields, and then what has been our recent research interest is to try to understand how to understand interchanges and interlinkages between government, business, and civil society at the level of policymaking at the societal level, which is actually fascinating potential topic to be explored further. Here are the hybrid dimensions. Then we have been interested in problems of value creation efforts, with the idea that we have our 2017 book was very much about how to define, how to understand hybrid organization as a concept. But of course, we try to move on to understand something related to the question what to do with the hybridity, what to do with that. And this has taken us to explore the issues of value creation in the hybrid settings. So for instance, how to mix different types of values in the context of state-owned enterprises, how to compromise on values in different types of PPP, public-private partnership arrangements. And what kind of consequences do we see? What kind of value conflicts we see? What kind of complications we may see and observe based on those types of settings? So we have tried to link hybridity also to the issues of fundamental issue of value creation kind of society. Also, in some of our papers and books, we have discussed this issue of node states and triads. Sort of fundamental forms of social organizing. Jan-Erik will address this later when he talks briefly about airline industry, which is a fascinating context for hybrid constellations. Briefly, two ways how to understand hybridity in the societal context, how to approach hybridity in the societal context. This is we have taken this from our own prior research, where we have tried to conceptualize two different viewpoints. The first one being that in many cases governments themselves have increased hybridity. So hybridity has increased based on or as an outcome of the government reform policies. Just very briefly, have an example. For the last 40 years plus minus, one of the policy rationales for reforming government activities has been the idea that if you want to economize on government activities, if you want to make government agencies more efficient and effective, you should make them behave and operate more like business firms. So the very, very basic, simple policy idea, actually very politically, institutionally very influential policy idea and rationale, saying that you should make them, government agencies, behave and operate more like business firms. But of course, we know that to some extent this has been almost close to naive assumption on how government activities in different contexts actually take place. But it has been very, very powerful policy doctrine and rationale. But when we have looked at more closely what has actually happened, you can see and you can observe the development that in some cases, in some societal contexts and sectors, that has actually taken place. So original government agencies have turned into government-owned enterprises. They have been privatized, and they have been sort of transformed into new types of market value in some sectors. For instance, the telecommunication industry in the 1980s and so on and so forth, which was, by the way, one of the antecedents for the rise of Finnish cell phone company Nokia in the 1990s. So that was part of the deregulation of the 1980s in the Nordic context. So you have seen that happening in many sectors of society and but on the other hand, I think it's fascinating to see how this is pretty different thing in some critical sectors of society that are actually very important to citizens and people. if you think about education and culture, social and health, science and scientific research, and other similar types of sectors and contexts where the same policy rationale has not taken place in the same way as for instance, in telecommunications. Rather, it has had an influence, such influence that these organizations not anymore they work like government agencies, but they are not either business firms. So they are actually at the moment something in between. So what actually governments have done themselves, they have increased hybridity in many ways. So they have created new types of hybrid constellations and hybrid forms of governance and organizations. So that would be the sort of aspect to policy discussion where governments have themselves increased hybridity. Another point that we have raised is a more timeless aspect. And we have used this already the ancient Romans type of argument, saying that if you look at the history of the Roman Republic area to 2000 plus minus years ago, you can see that they already have their own hybrid forms of governance at the time. They had their organizational form that they actually called Societas Publicanorum, which was sort of what we would call nowadays contracting out. So you had external service providers providing services to the Roman Republic government, collecting taxes, which was turned out to be quite violent method of collecting taxes, but that would be another story. But maintaining public spaces and doing the usual sort of traditional public duties to the government. But they were organized as a sort of hybrid form of governance already at that time. So what we have sort of articulated and argued is that what defines public and private and the borderlines between public and private is actually very much temporally bound. So that's something that's would be quite important aspect to discuss. Also, we have addressed this as I briefly mentioned, this value creation problem. And we have proposed, we have made 3 proposals for understanding value creation mechanisms in the context of hybrid settings. We have talked about mixing different types of value, market values with public and social values, and so on and so forth. We have talked about compromising with the idea that if you're part of the hybrid governance arrangements, probably you need to make compromises and give up some of the value that you would have been able to acquire in the original setting. So you have to make compromises in order to have the sort of arrangements sort of enacted and complete. So and that's very much about the notion of hybridity, that it's not the best in terms of the business profitability, and it's probably not the best one in the sort of traditional public service ethos or government ethos, but it's something in between. So that's part of the logic of doing compromises. And we have addressed this legitimizing aspect, which is about communicating and trying to legitimize our activities to multiple audiences simultaneously. And this is one characteristic of hybridity and hybrid organizations. Well, they actually need to do that in many different senses. And just very briefly, I'm not going to go into the details of this, but of course, as in any research topic, you have these extremes. You have the sort of positive side, the sort of cute little pet type of metaphor of hybridity as a panacea or solution to current and future policy problems, which may be, to take it to a very extreme, it would be a naive assumption that this could be the case. But going to the other extreme, to talk about the dark side of hybridity, I think the most influential argument that you can get from here is the Jane Jacobs' nice reflection on the syndromes between commercial syndromes and government syndromes. So probably you don't only see positive impacts on the hybridity constellations, but it can be so that not everything is bad in the hybrid governance arrangements as well. As professors, as researchers, we are mostly interested in understanding how the things evolve, what actually happens, basically. So this has been our approach. Briefly, just to open up the discussion to Jan-Erik, but briefly to mention that we have ourselves discussed universities as hybrid organizations, and I think one of the interesting features of universities as hybrid organizations is how they try to talk to three different audiences simultaneously. We have used Burton Clark's ideas from the early 1980s when he talked about three forms of steering universities. You have the state logic or state approach. Universities are closely linked and associated with the nation states in different parts of the world, to governments in the Nordic countries, for instance. Most of the funding for the universities comes from the government, so you have ministries working in that area, and so on and so forth. So you have the state logic and state approach. You have the market approach and logic. We have students, we have partners, we have collaborators in so many different fields, and so we sort of try to legitimize our activities in universities to markets, in quotes, as well. And then, of course, what Burton Clark actually frames nicely, intelligibly here in this context is when he talks about academic oligarchy, which is simply to think that how to define the good level and good quality of scientific research. Can you ask that from the government? I think that's. Can you ask that from students or other partners? Probably not from them, but from our peers, basically. So this is the sort of peer review logic. And if you take all these three logics together, it's no wonder that in many cases, in many processes of university reporting, for instance, performance reporting, this paper was based on trying to understand the ambiguity of performance reporting of universities. And we tried to do that using the sort of hybrid lens of having these three institutional logics competing, to some extent being in contradiction with each other in the university context. So it's no wonder that it's a messy and ambiguous constellation of many activities. But Jan-Erik, I will throw this to you and stop sharing. So if you want to.
Okay.
So please.
Thank you, Jarmo. This was also a very interesting lecture. I haven't heard it for a while. Okay, can you see it?
Yes, we can. You can increase it so we don't see the slides of slideshow or yeah.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay.
And hybridity is a very interesting subject. I used to be normal, but now I became hybrid. Some contextual variation, for instance, take state-owned enterprises, and you see that government is major shareholder in these enterprises mainly, and you might have some private ownership also. US literature in particular is very critical over Chinese business and Chinese state-owned enterprises. They argue that they are inefficient, they use cheap labor, use government subsidies and finance, and are able to use free land and facilities. But they are intriguing in terms of their structures. For instance, they have this three-tier structure emulating European business cooperation with shareholders meeting board and the supervisory board as well. And over the half of the Chinese state-owned enterprises follow this type of hybrid governance form, where you have politics and corporate governance at the same organization. So Communist Party section, employee association, and employee meeting together with these European type of government structures. And also, as in Chinese context, there's a problem of corruption. So that they aim ideological education to management to decrease corruption and then offer financial perks for employees to increase efficiency. We cannot see this type of a structure in Western world or democratic industrial countries, but this exists in China. This is the most common form of organizing state-owned enterprises there. But contextual variation from the theme. Another type of developments relate to social enterprises, and as you may know, social enterprises, they combine some social mission and objective with some kind of business activity. And then the historical development has been such that in USA after beginning of 1980s, the big government faded away, and there were decrease in funding for non-profits, which were the main providers of social welfare services in many cases, meant that these organizations, they had to find other sources of income. And what they did, they started businesses which were not related to their social mission. So, for instance, Scouts selling cookies. Scouts are not involved in cookie business, or they are not trying to invent industries in selling bakeries or sugary stuff, but they just want to have some extra money for their trips. So this is non-related business example. At the same time, in 1980s, the situation of unemployment was very bad in Europe, and for non-profits, it was possible to get government subsidies to employ people. And this is the way that happened in Europe, so that increasing government subsidies meant that more and more non-profits became employers of people who were previously unemployed. So they became dependent on government subsidies and got closer to government than in US. So exactly the same type of organization structure, but it became different in different places because there were contextual pressures to adapt to changing conditions. So these two examples of different cases or major cases in terms of hybridity. Then I want to briefly discuss about global air travel, which is an intriguing case in terms of hybridity. You could argue first that it's a type of incomplete government contracting, because you need government contracts to be able to travel from A to B. Yet again, you could see it as non-regulated business because it has government influence within competitive business arrangements. And therefore, it has two sides, competitive business and government agreements. And I will go directly to this idea of basic network analysis. So in terms of organizations, airlines can be purely private, so shareholder-owned, or the businesses, they can be purely public. In many cases, governments own their flagship carriers, and there's no private involvement. And in some cases, these companies are purely hybrid. So you have some private investment or major private investment, but also government stakes in these companies. So this is the organizational point of view to this business. Then also, if you want to travel from between two airports, you need a government agreement. So states make an agreement to allow airlines to take off and land between two airports. And there are some 3,000 agreements going on in the world. And for instance, in Finland, our national airlines, it has minority government ownership at the moment. And it was in a good competitive position because the route to Asia was very good. Shortest route from Europe to Asia came through Helsinki. But of course, the flight went over Russia. And now the situation is that Russia has forbade other international airlines to travel through their airspace. So we have lost the competitive edge on this in this respect, which also identifies the problem of competitive business, because it's dependent upon government contracts. And also within this industry, countries don't allow foreign airlines to travel between 2 points in your own country, which means that you cannot have global airline company because there's restrictions on traveling between 2 points in your own country. Therefore, these airlines have formed alliances, which is hybrid in terms of transaction cost economics logics. So they are not. It's not purely market transaction. It's not an organization, but it's agreement between airlines to share their codes and schedule their routes and improve these loyalty programs. And within this conglomerates or these alliances, you basically have one big Asian company, one big US company, one big European company. And of course, within this alliances, you have both public airlines, private airlines, and hybrid airlines. So it's hybridity in different levels of governance. And of course, airline business is also dependent on government aid in terms of direct stakes in airlines such as in Airbus or defense contracts such as in US. And this is also a point of controversy of getting government subsidies, and also with publicly owned airports and getting slots within these airports. It creates another aspect of hybridity. But in terms of levels of analysis and levels of networks, this airline case illustrates well the aspect of hybridity on different levels of existence. Then another aspect of hybridity, which is not connected to the organizations as such, is the professionalism. And when you look at the basic professionals, so lawyers and doctors, they work independently, and no manager can intervene in the practice of doctors and lawyers. More and more, even poor professionals become controlled by organizations. They have to obey hierarchy. They must achieve some results. They are accountability on their actions. It's not only independent profession, but somewhat controlled by the organization. Then when they lose even more of their control, they become hybrid. So they become managed by the organization. And at the last stage, when they reach the position of combining management and professional expertise in particular persons, so that professionals become also managers, it is beyond hybridity in terms of professionals. And this discussion, it is a big one, and there's lots of discussion, especially in healthcare, how to combine the duties of doctors with that of managerial work. And it is ongoing debate how to do that, and it's not easy, but complex task to do that. Not just to mention one area of discussion. Then our own work, Jarmo already introduced these ideas of mixing, compromising, and legitimizing. And in our work on Baltic Sea and nutrient recycling, which in fact relates to the spreading of manure in the fields in agriculture, we've studied the era for over 10 years, and this idea grew out of the problem with Baltic Sea, which is very, very polluted, one of the polluted seas in the world, because the water doesn't change very well, and it had non-governmental organization presence, and president of the country was inaugurating the negotiation to start to improve the position of Baltic Sea. Then it got some legitimation, so people welcomed this idea, so that we should try to do something about this. And then next government took this as their spearhead project and started to invest some money into it, and invited private business take part in these small projects, and business also was eager to participate and started to develop new products. So mixing of public policy goals with the business goals. Second stage. At the third stage, then another government which took hold of these ideas and tried to implement these so that farmers would use manure instead of chemical fertilizers in their fields, which was somewhat aided by the crisis in Ukraine, because many of the fertilizers in Europe come from Ukraine and also Belarus, which are now banned from exporting their products. But still, farmers have not gained much about these developments and have been reluctant to use these old methods of fertilizing their fields, especially because it's very costly, even though it has happened previously in history. So it's uneven compromise, inventing new ideas, making it legitimate among the general population, but the end users have not been very eager to employ them. So long story short, and there's a publication on that as well. So on this regulation idea, and I have been really keen reader about regulation and David's idea of these aspects. And we don't have time to go into details, but these demarcation areas between economy, polity, civil society are very interesting. So for instance, in telecommunication, it is not only that the regulation has increased, it has also been totally deregulated as a business. And also the telecommunication standardization, it has become more industry dependent, so that industry develops their own standards. Of course, you need some kind of approval of government to make them usable within the country, so that they need some label to be accepted. But still, industry is more and more developing their own standards without government intervention. And the shift of balance with telecommunication standardization is moving from Europe and US to Asia, where the production is the highest. Then between civil society and polity, for instance, forestry standards, things like that, sometimes non-governmental organizations have developed standards, for instance, sustainable forestry, which are used by governments to regulate business. So civil society uses their own ways of regulating government and business. And then sometimes even social enterprises, which are at least partly business oriented, can have serious impact on the regulation as well. For instance, fair trade organization, which give labels for companies if they use if they give enough compensation for the farmers when they grow their products. So it makes money out of giving these labels, but gives labels only to the companies who are fair in their trade in terms of the producers. And of course, you have big theoretical questions as well. For instance, Elinor Ostrom's ideas of common pool resources, so that local communities are best to take care of their depleting resources such as forestries and fisheries, with some backing from government. So this is an area of hybrid research as well. Then, as I try to be as brief as possible, I invite you all to IRSPM conference next year in Tampere, and we have a very nice topic: hybrid future for public governance and management, 16th to 18th of April. We have our own panel on hybrid governance, and we hope to have even more panels on this subject. There are some special issues we have compiled earlier: public budgeting, accounting and financial management, public money and management, accounting, auditing, accountability journal, and we are doing special issue on Australian Journal of Public Administration at the moment. And then there's a picture of few forthcoming books, one on policy and one on accounting and hybridization. And then these books, as Jarmo already mentioned, appeared earlier. If you have time, then you might be interested in having them. The green one includes lots of developments in different parts of the world, and the first one gives theoretical elaboration of different aspects of hybridity. And then some recent works these past few years we have compiled, which we may give you to you as part of this lecture. So thank you for watching. This was great pleasure.
Thank you very much. We'll remove the slides and bring you and myself to the front, and I will start with my own questions, which aims to trigger the discussion. So can you please tell us, briefly, with few examples, or few points, is hybridity good or bad? To whom? And I have a follow-up question, but let's start with this.
So, if I can start, as Jarmo explained well, we have no definite idea about that. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad.
It's hybrid answer.
No, but you can find out bad examples. For instance, this classic example is private prison, which tends to treat inmates badly and tries to get more harsher punishments from policymakers in order to get more clients. So this is an example of very bad type of hybridity. But then, of course, some types of public-private partnerships, they are very good in terms of their outcomes. Not always, but sometimes they are, so that you get motorways quicker and with less cost. So then a success. But there's two sides of it. You cannot tell.
Can I briefly add to your nice question, Dave? As I said earlier, I think one sort of philosophical standpoints here would be to say that as researchers, you should be open to both directions, basically, because we all know that in the area of policy research discussion, there are often studies that have already the intended outcome in mind when they do the analysis, because they want to propagate or justify the positive outcome of certain policy or negative outcome of certain policy. But as Jan-Erik mentioned, I think in the area of hybridity, it's too complicated an issue to take a sort of only one-sided approach to that. So in that sense, I think explicitly we are open to both directions. But I think in quite many cases, as always in policy and governance issues and topics, is that rarely there are no issues that would be only good or only bad. But they both have, of course, positive impacts, but sometimes negative impacts, sometimes negative unintended impacts, and so on and so on. So I think hybridity is no exception in this respect. I would say. Nice question. Nice question.
Thinking about hybridity, I think can we really define or find or identify an area where there is a pure mode of governance, or all governance is hybrids, or all regimes, policy regimes are hybrid in one way or another, or in all aspects. Can you think about a field, an issue that is purely one mode of government?
One of our inspiration was this Barry Boseman's idea that all organizations are public. and he uses this idea of economic and political authority. And then when you start thinking in those terms, so hybridity would be situated in a way, in a space which has least amount of either authority.
Yes.
So if we start from that, so you could argue that everything is hybridity, but in different magnitudes, so that when you reach the political side of things, then you tend to be more political, and then when you go to economic authority, you become more economical, and you lose hybridity at both ends.
Yeah.
This is not totally satisfactory, but then this is how it goes.
I think that's a nice reflection by Jan-Erik. I just want to add that in our 2017 book, Governing Hybrid Organizations, we also sort of tried to understand how the sort of societies and actually government systems also work. That sometimes they try to get rid of hybridity by making by transforming things more into pure forms as they actually are. Basically, I think, Jan-Erik, we call that administrative pragmatism in the 2017 book, which is to say that in historically in many sectors and contexts of society, you see the sort of mixed borderlines between issues and activities. But in order to make them, to create a sort of social order in society, you try to divide issues from each other just to make them more governable, more manageable, and more sort of more understandable. Even though you have this fundamental issue of whether they are pure forms of governance at all. So I think in many cases also governments and societies themselves, using administrative pragmatism, they try to sort of make the things more divided into public and private as they actually are. Yeah. So this is only one sort of policy making approach to think of.
Yeah, I remember the day I first. This is an anecdote. It's not the day I first identified in the library shelves in the University of Haifa. It was 1989, 88, maybe 1990, the book by Barry Bozeman, a red book, very thin one, and it says, all organizations are public. And I said, wow. And I read it and said, okay, but all organizations are also private. What do I do with it? And, so I remember the physical moment of finding this book, but I'll stop here and allow questions from others if they have, because I do have some comments, but more comments, but maybe Hans or Oren or Dionis, Susanna wants to join. Oren, and then Hans, if you want.
Yes, thank you for very interesting questions, and I want to follow the last comment or follow David's questions. Would you think it will be accurate to say that once we have an interaction between sectors of society, institutional interaction between sectors of society, we can start to speak about hybridity? Is that this institutional interaction is the birth of hybridity in terms of looking at sectors of society as a sole or binary and functional entities?
In many cases, that is really the case. So interaction, not necessarily cooperation. Sometimes these parts of society might be in competing situation or in rivalrous position, or just opposite directions. But the interaction in many cases signifies the idea of hybridity. But we haven't really thought this through. We are about to write something about this, but then we might be wiser in a few months' time how to define it properly. But interaction is a good starting point.
So if I may, so hybridity is a very inclusive and very loose concept as you presented it, and according to this kind of definition. So maybe you can identify what is not hybrid, for example, what hybridity is not.
Yes, that is also a very good question. And then when you start with hybridity, everything starts to be hybrid. And it is also true, starting with Boseman's idea that all organizations are public, they are also private. Starting with hybridity, you have different levels of hybridity.
Yeah, okay.
Even governments are not poor types.
Yeah. I think this probably takes us to the sort of very fundamental discussions and reflections on the origins of any sort of institutional concepts. I think, as I probably mentioned in the beginning of our talk, that in our book, Governing Hybrid Organizations, we were more interested in the sort of definitional side of the hybridity, how to understand what is hybrid and what's not hybrid. But I think when we looked at the organizational studies using Barry Boseman and others, also others addressing the issue, what is actually a public organization or private organization. So you end up, you quite soon you end up seeing very loose conceptualizations in the original wordings of the concepts. Of course, if you look at the one part of the discussion that we had in the 2017 book also was about goods. So public and private goods. If you look at the Paul Samuelson original formulation of what the public good as a concept means, and if you look at the respective discussion, discussion after that, immediately after that, the discussion started whether, well, actually there are no pure public goods. There are goods with different characteristics and dimensions of publicness. So I think, but this is what we have seen, that if you start to take this route, this road, so you end up having sort of very existential ontological discussions on any concept. But I think it's good way to think that in a way that as we have seen that it's not easy if you start from the original foundation as hybridity. If you start from that, it's much more difficult to use any prior research discussion, because most of the prior research discussion is based on the idea that there would be a sort of pure types of business firms and business organizations, as well as public and government type of organizations. So it's much more difficult to actually, that we would have to create a completely new theory of hybridity that would be something else that we have at the moment. So yeah. And that would be I would welcome you all to join that effort if we want to do that. But I think it would be a great, big effort.
Thank
but
you.
I think that there are some very many conceptual issues in the original wordings of the organizations and public and private goods and so on.
Yeah. Excellent. Dionis, thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the interesting presentation. I was wondering what you think is like the effect of, you know, those hybrid organizations or the prevalence of those hybrid organizations on policy making. Because I mean, we know, of course, that, you know, private actors, but also public actors try to influence the policy process for, you know, given interests. But now that we have like this hybrid type, what might this like influence, you know, look like, and which direction? Because I mean, like it's a stereotypical assumption, but we probably could say that, you know, private actors favor less regulation, freedom of market, and so on. But now that we have like this hybrid type, which direction would they opt for?
That is a very good question. And sometimes what we have been thinking is that it might be that hybrid organizations are in better position to be children of both worlds. So that in terms of financing, if you have good ties to government, you might be able to get some government subsidies. And then if you're a private company, at the same time, you could enjoy bank loans, so that you can use two types of financing mechanism at the same time. And of course, sometimes if you are hybrid, then you can use government contracting and also consumer behavior. So you can sell products and also enjoy government subsidies. And according to fluctuation, you could even use both. So this is a positive side of it.
Yeah. Thank
Just briefly, another type of, I think research discussion on public policy is also a very good sort of indication of the sort of in our scientific world, how to organize our scientific research efforts. But as we are sort of going into the process of trying to understand more about the hybridity in what we call public policies, with an emphasis on public, I think we need to much more fully understand the sort of interactions between private consultants giving advice to governments in policy making. What David has done, for instance, much more understanding different forms of regulation that can be, in quotes, purely public or private form of regulation, so as Jan-Erik mentioned earlier, the industrial based regulational forms and so on. And I think one of the efforts for us probably in the future is to try to understand more how the hybridity is linked or associated with different forms and modes of policymaking. That has been influenced very much about the idea that every single public policy making effort starts from the government, goes through the apparatus and mechanisms of government, which is not actually, when you look at the empirical life, that's not true, probably. Yeah. But how to understand, how to conceptualize that more fully, I think we don't, at the moment, we don't have the conceptual apparatus to deal with that. That would be my point, a sort of disciplinary point of view.
Thank you, Jarmo. We have a question from Hans and then Susanna, and try to be concise, and because we are over time. So Hans, please.
Well, just one question. I'm very busy with a PhD on state-owned enterprises. And is it not more wise to define hybridity specifically for a specific kind of organizations? Because I have the feeling that hybridity for state-owned enterprises is something different than, for instance, by NGOs or et cetera, because they have very specific elements. Is that correct? Or do you say, well, keep it on a general level?
Thank you, Hans, for this question. This is really a good question. What we have been using SOEs as an example of types of ownership, which people tend to know. So this is only as an example. Yeah. We can find others, but then giving a lecture or brief description of these elements, these are things that people tend to know. So that's the point.
But just very briefly, Hans, to your nice question, I would say that in general, hybridity takes different forms in different types of hybridity contexts. So of course, SOEs can be quite different from the hybrid logic can be quite different, for instance, in comparison with respect to for instance, PPP, public-private partnership arrangements, or other types of. So I probably would encourage you to see the very rich discussion already on SOEs, state-owned enterprise, in the context of hybrid, in the context of hybrid governance. So I think you will find your unique way to think of that. I think.
Thank you.
Please, Susanna.
Hi, thank you. I missed the beginning of the presentation, so I'm sorry if I ask a question that you have already answered, but I would like to hear your thoughts on first the risks of this hybridity and the blurring between what is public and not public. And second, on the internal functioning of these hybrid organizations. Do they, can we also talk about hybrid modes of governance within the hybrid organizations?
I can answer the last part of the question. I think that the application of institutional logics perspective is the most used perspective in studies of hybridity, and it certainly relates to internal aspects of organizations. So you employ market logics and social logic at the same time within the organization. And then I would also say that most of the research is done, it relates to the idea that how you deal with this.
Yeah. Is it okay now? I think I'm...
So use levels of people to discrepancy between different goals. But then I lost the first part. I heard it, but then...
It was on the risks of hybridity.
This was on the risks of hybridity.
Yes.
Which is another way to say, is it good or bad? What are the bad parts, right? Or the risky parts?
I think in my mind, that would be, I probably addressed this earlier to some extent, that probably we have to understand it more case by case than as a general argument, I think. This applies to Hans, your reflection and discussion on the SOE, state-owned enterprise context. So probably there are certain risks related to the state-owned enterprise as a mode of organization or mode of governance in terms of hybridity. And there can be totally different types of risks of hybridity. For instance, mega projects organized as a sort of hybrid constellation of PPP and others. Another point that I want to probably, this could be my final, as we are over time already, but my final point would be that we have talked about or discussed two types of sort of perspectives on how to understand hybridity and governance together. So you can talk about hybrid forms of governance, which relates to governance activity as such. So you mix and combine different modes of governance in coordinating and sort of controlling and coordinating societal activities. But that would be one issue. But another issue is how to govern hybridity that exists in the institutional world. And that is something that I noticed in quite many papers and books, and probably not always authors are very clear on this distinction. Or what do you think, Jan-Erik? But this has been one of the topics that we have discussed. So hybrid governance and governing hybridity, which are, in a way, they are two different aspects of hybridity.
Yeah.
Yes, I think that's a very good point. And for instance, take a private army, which relates also to this monopoly of physical force of a country. So even in the US and Russia, these major countries in warfare employ private armies. So this is a hybrid policy making, but it's different, and it also exists in terms of organizations. So you have private company doing the warmongering, and sometimes we can have this at both levels, so at both policy level and both organizational level. We have to elaborate on that.
Yes. Let me conclude before thank you to both of you and all the participants. I'd like to say where hybridity, two mentions of hybridity and how I feel I worked with it. One is the concept of regulatory regime. So the regulatory regime is really a collection of actors and mode of governance and institutions that govern different issues. So we can speak about a regime perspective, which is almost always hybrid. And this can be a policy regime, international regime, regulatory regime, etc. So I felt always that I'm working with kind of hybrid understanding of the environment that we are dealing with. This is one, but also with regard to the conception of the state itself, like it's not either a welfare state or capitalist state or democratic state or a developmental state, China, Japan, or laissez-faire state. It's always a combination of different institutional logic. So in one of my research project was on the regulatory welfare state, a combination of the welfare and regulatory state into kind of hybrid institution. So the state, and this speaks about the theory of the state. It's not on the public management level, it's not on the mode of government, it's not on the organization itself, but it's really about what is the state. So hybrid, I like the concept of hybridity, and I'm happy to interact with you on this. And so this takes me to say to the point of concluding this session. And thank you very much, Jan-Erik Johanson and Jarmo Vakkuri for nice presentation and for a beginning of a dialogue. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was our pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.